I'm Claudine Wong, joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm joined now by Stephanie Jolly, who is coming to us from across the country. And I'm so excited that we're chatting because you call yourself kind of an accidental player in this COVID-19 information gathering world that we are in. And you're in Kentucky, correct?
So I'm a resident of Kentucky. I've actually been self-isolating in New York City because that's where I was when a lot of this happened. But yes, I am a Kentucky resident.
Okay, and so you have, I assume, lots of friends and family and a interest in what's happening there. Tell me what you do for a living, so when we can set people up to understand why that this kind of was something that you would be able to help us see in a new way, the COVID-19 and the sheltering in place measures.
So I'm an online educator, and I do a lot with math and science, largely for high school students. And so a big part of my job is taking a lot of complex information and then making it just digestible and comprehensible to someone who wants to be able to parse a lot of complicated data. So,
and if you talk about complicated data, COVID-19 would fall right into that category and sit in there and settle in, because the numbers and everything that's going across. I mean, we have pulled up, as a news organization, trying to figure out all these different ways to have it make sense to people. One of the things that people always point to, though, when we're talking about shelter in place, and I know this is something that you referenced as something that, was helpful to you, is this graph right here when we talk about it. And this is from the Washington Post that I just grabbed. And this is the Philadelphia, St. Louis Spanish flu epidemic from 1918. And I think this is one. Were you familiar with this before the COVID-19?
I was familiar with this just from a general kind of, U.S. history standpoint. I think everyone in Kentucky has since become familiar with this graph. It has been in a lot of the 5 p.m. News conferences. A lot of people have been saying that initially they were saying, oh, this is going to be the new St. Louis, Philadelphia graph. I really hope it's not, right? Because that means that we didn't enact the measures in time. And that means that there is going to be, kind of a control group rather than 2 states that were able, in fact, to take control of it. So I really hope that this graph doesn't.
But this is maybe the starting point. This is our diving board where we leap into the pool of trying to prevent it from happening again, and we learn from history and go from there. I mean, to give people who are watching right now and say, okay, tell me about this this graph. I've kind of heard about it, but of course this was September of 1918, and the flu was kind of coming. It's in the way that we heard it coming to Washington State and the state of California, the case here and a case there. And it was how 2 different cities, as opposed to 2 different states, dealt with it. And one had a big parade and one didn't. And that's where you see, I mean, the flattening the curve. Have we all learned that so much in terms of this is the bad graph when we're talking about the curve not being flat? This is St. Louis, and they enacted their social distancing right away. And and Philadelphia did not, and that's where we see that. I mean, we've seen so many different reference points. I think the most recent one I've seen was the discussion about the San Francisco 49ers losing the Super Bowl and therefore not having a parade to celebrate the Super Bowl win in San Francisco. And that was the day of the Super Bowl was the same day the first COVID-19 the center was set up at UCSF. So like there's been a lot of analogies to that. In terms of Kentucky and Tennessee, when we're talking about that, because that's where you focused on, when you're looking at that graph, you're trying to prevent that one from happening. What made you take a second look at the numbers and say, maybe if we don't pay attention, we might not actually, we might be in a different place?
I mean, I think we've all seen numbers coming from other countries. So even though it was more recent with hitting Kentucky and Tennessee, there was data from other locations long before we actually started to see the growth here. And the epidemiologists have been putting a lot of that out. In the very, very early days of this graph, long before you could really make any long-term projections, but you were seeing that very distinct exponential curve of Tennessee. And at the time, even though of course Kentucky's growth was also exponential, it visually didn't look that way. And so it was one of those almost self-evident models that people could look at and they could say, I get it, I see it. And in fact, that's what a lot of people had mentioned to me when they reached out. They said, this is the data that I needed to see. this is what I needed in order to either convince my family members that they really should be social distancing or taking this seriously, or this is what I needed for myself to realize that I'm doing the right thing, even though it's difficult. And so,
okay, yeah. So I pulled one up from, this is the March 6th to the March 21st graph. What did you think was important to put into this, and why did you? I don't want to say pick on Tennessee, in terms of, because I know you've made that very clear. Like, this is not anti-Tennessee. This is just
no.
It's just a comparison in terms of what it means. Because even now, even today, states are still debating this.
Right.
One, not only should we do it, and there are places that are still resistant to, doing a lot of social distancing or how hard they come down, and the debate about how quickly we get back when we should not social distance anymore. There are some reports saying it'll be 2022 before we stop social distancing, which I think makes everyone's, kind of, oh, that's hard to imagine. But in this, this is, was one of your first, or, it was early on, because I know you've done several more.
Definitely early on. Yeah.
What did you want to include in this?
So I think initially I was just looking at the case numbers, which I think is the number that a lot of individuals can look at that, and it makes sense to them, right? They know exactly what it means of like how many people have tested positive. I also wanted to add in the number of tests that had been done, because of course one of the most obvious kind of criticisms would be, well, if no one's tested, then obviously the numbers are lower. So at the time I gathered what data that there was from the Department of Health websites to add that in, just to get that extra context. And of course, if you're actually doing epidemiological data, you don't want to look at just raw numbers. You sort of want to look at things like per capita, because there are different population spreads. And so I added that in as well. So I started to just basically share both. So for those who wanted the per capita data, who wanted to use that as a point of comparison, it was there. For those who it just really made more sense for them personally to understand, take it seriously, we want to make sure that we're social distancing because we don't want the numbers to increase, I continue to put out just the raw case numbers.
Yeah, and let me see if I have one.
That data does.
Yeah, this is just cases confirmed.
Exactly.
And so there's the difference between the per capita and the cases. The graphs, though, whether or not you're doing one versus the other in terms of, people are looking at this, right? They're looking at this is Tennessee here, and this is Kentucky here, with Kentucky being the example of social distancing early, right here, in the March 6th, March 7th, declaring the state of emergency, and then over on March 13th, Tennessee doing it, and how that changes, even though this time period, everything looked very similar. We're only talking 6 days,
Exactly. And it just, and of course, there, of course, lots of other things had happened in Tennessee, right? They were dealing with a natural disaster. There were other things there as well. But I think that when I released this graph, it was still in that very initial phase of decision making. And so people were having to make that decision of, which trajectory do I want to be on? Do I want to be on the path that looks like it's growing much stronger, or do I want to be on the path that's not? And so I think it definitely encouraged people to personally social distance, and also to start advocating from their own governments. I know people in Tennessee were certainly advocating and using this graph as a point of advocacy for themselves, to say, we want some of these policies in place. We want some of these protections as well, so that social distancing doesn't become a matter of privilege, so that everyone can stay at home if they want to, not just those that can easily transition.
Right. Did that surprise you? How you've said you're an accidental COVID-19 grapher, in terms of how this really, but governors were using your graphs to say, hey, and that comes from like, oh, I thought this would be interesting, I'm going to share it, to, oh wait, am I the leading, person in terms of how to put this in a format that other people can understand?
I think that's been the thing that has that I've been really curious to kind of see is, why this graph? I'm not an epidemiologist. There are lots of great models out there, lots of more complicated models, lots of more, data scientists are really crunching these numbers. And so I wonder if it was the fact that this was really an infographic in that sense of not saying here's what will happen, but here's what could. And by putting out really preliminary data, in a sense, that enabled people to look at this and say, I've been hearing from public health experts I should stay at home. And some states have been hearing that we have these measures. Here's some data that actually kind of connects all of those, when we were really in a bit of an information storm. So much data, so many conflicting pieces of data, a lot of debate. And so for many, this was just that final piece of the puzzle that said, okay, you know what, like this is data that affirms or reaffirms what I feel that we should be doing anyway and what I'm hearing. And so
How quickly
it
did
was
it
the
spread?
simplicity of it that made it useful.
How long did it take you to make that first graph? And then how quickly did it start just kind of taking off into this different space?
I was actually sitting right here actually when I made it, sitting on this couch. And it took, I don't know, like an hour or two to compile the data and then, cross-reference to make sure that I was getting the most accurate source of that information. I put it on Facebook just to kind of share it out with some friends of mine. And one said, hey, can you make this public? I want to share it with some of my friends too. And so I did, and then when I woke up the next morning, it had gone viral overnight.
That's how it works, right? It takes.
I was not prepared for the social media storm to follow, for sure.
You always hear, I went to sleep, and then boom, in the morning, everything has changed. Did you get pushback? Did you get any pushback, or was it mostly, people saying, I would imagine, hey, can you compare that to my state? I want one that applies to me as well specifically.
Yeah, it was in fact a lot of that. I would say about 90% positive, about 10% pushback. And the pushback, I think, initially was because I had used the state kind of school colors for University of Kentucky, University of Tennessee. So there was a lot of rivalry saying, like, hey, it's not that I want, Kentucky to win this. I would in fact prefer everyone here in the U.S. to win the battle with COVID-19. So I think there was a little bit of initial pushback there, but by and large, it was people saying, this is what I needed to see. Can I get this so that I can share it out? Can you compare my state? I want my governor, I want my mayor to be doing this. And I'm still getting around that kind of level of feedback. It's mostly positive.
So are you
anything going public, there's going to be some pushback for one degree of another.
Yeah. I mean, if there wasn't, then that would be a story within itself. Right. And I want to see you've done some other ones. Let me see if I can pull this one up full. This one goes to April 11th. So it's a little bit, further out. Have you seen, because your graphs have been used, right? Because people have used them as reference points and saying, oh, this is what I needed. Anything that, and did you expect anything to be able to change in these curves? I mean, we're still seeing, here's the positive numbers of tests in Tennessee, and here's Kentucky. You do make a point, the last graph we looked at earlier, let me see if I can go back. This ended on the 25th. Mm-hmm. Over here, you can see here around the 25th, that's where you see non-essential businesses ordered to close and the Healthy at Home acted. And then Tennessee still even, 6 days later doing a similar thing. So do you think this has actually led to any specific change that would lead to any change in, we don't like the up, we'd like the flat and then the coming back down?
Yeah, I would, in fact, I would be hopeful that, in fact, these graphs encourage people across state lines to take personal action to self-distance, even before that was the policy. And so that in and of itself could have potentially been one of those pieces that for some were able to flatten the curve. I think there's too many pieces, there's too many variables here to attribute any one particular action. We know that epidemiologists are really saying, earlier is better, kind of period. But to attribute any one specific piece, that's really not for me to say. I'd be hopeful that these graphs had served the public good and that they were either used to advocate for stronger public health policies, or that people were able to view them and then take the best action for themselves as a result.
Yeah, and this one you have cases confirmed as well, and you continue to do the number of, this is a different one with a number of positive cases. I mean, there are so many different ways we could look at this. And I think that's been some of the challenge with all the graphs out that you mentioned, is that because there are so many different ways to look at it, it makes our eyes cross. Where have you kind of focused in order to make sure that what you're creating too, it continues to kind of hit that point of, oh, that's what I needed to see?
So I think at this point, we're almost in a different phase. It's almost like, everyone has made their decision for themselves already. Either they're sheltering in place and their states have taken action, or they're sort of unable to shelter in place because their work has been deemed essential, or they don't have the protections
Mm-hmm.
from their government to be able to not go to work, even if they do feel like they're putting themselves at risk because they don't have job security, or they wouldn't get unemployment, or they wouldn't have health care if they were to lose their job. So at this point, I've just continued with the trends that I had started, using the same data sources. Certainly with any type of data gathering using these public sources, it's problematic because both the Tennessee Department of Health and the Kentucky Department of Health have changed the way they've reported their data. Tennessee has done actually a phenomenal job providing a lot of nuance and granularity to that data, which has been really very useful. And in fact, started about 2 days after I made the initial graph, they started reporting the negative numbers coming from private and commercial testing. But of course, we know testing is, underdone throughout.
Yeah, I mean, and I find it, whatever numbers, we have viewers that tell us, can you also give us this number? And can you give us in relation to the state? Because, I'm in California. And so when you give the number of cases and versus the people who live in the state, that percentage is different from, a smaller state, like Kentucky versus California. However, I also find myself telling people, I'm like, there are so many numbers. We literally have to pick which ones we give you, and it doesn't mean the other ones aren't important, but we just can't continue to do numbers and numbers and numbers. Have you done ones for other states, or is that just so much for you to take
I
on?
haven't. In fact, I have, I've had other people, through Facebook and through Twitter, they have kind of used these as a model, and they've been generating them for their own states. I had shared out kind of the way that I had been doing the graphs so that other people would be able to create their own using some of those data sources.
That
but
seems like a better way to do it, right? So that's not all on your shoulders.
Exactly. I mean, I'm happy to, I was
Yeah.
happy to share exactly how I set it up so that people could just plug in numbers from their own data and generate the graph using some of those accessible pieces of software. But I personally haven't just had the bandwidth to tackle others. Although I do, I definitely think that there are good other models out there. I mean, you even see like New York versus the Bay Area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two other places that with similar densities, or a good enough comparison there that you can see some differences in the timeline. And certainly I'm sure as this progresses, there'll be other a lot more data that we can use as a comparison.
Do you find that because you have the perspective of Kentucky versus New York, with different sensibilities, different exposures, different ways that people live, right? In New York, everyone is kind of, vertical, right? In how their living spaces are, and they don't have as much space in between. And I see that people, I think, look at the shelter in places and the restrictions in different ways depending on where they live, right? I think for people in New York, it can feel very restrictive because you don't have a yard that you can go around in. The perspective of being from Kentucky and New York, has that helped you kind of in terms of really understanding how hard it is for all of us to process this world that we're living in?
Yeah, it does in fact seem like in some ways two different realities. I mean, here over the last week, we've been hitting the surge. I hear sirens and birds, and that's it. Whereas in Kentucky, my husband is in fact he's being quarantined in Kentucky. We actually got separated throughout this.
Oh no!
But
sorry.
we're doing the right thing, right? We're each kind of isolating and quarantining ourselves. But it is very different because you can go for a drive, right? You can get out. It is easier to find space, whereas even if you were to go out to a park or something like that, there's so many other people that also want to be in that same green space that it is very hard to get that distance. Whereas in other places, there's a bit of a natural distancing. Houses are further apart.
Right. Well, I was telling someone, I'm like, parks are still generally open, but here, if you were walking through them, but they're not packed. So that we were having a mask discussion. Like, do you need to wear a mask if you're walking through an area that's not crowded? Obviously, if you're walking to a crowded park, then wearing a mask might be a good idea. But that's why someone who was saying that wearing a mask at the park, no, it just, you have to look at what the park looks like, I think. in that
Yeah,
state.
it is. I mean, it is a very different kind of reality, even talking about grocery shopping, right? So if you're in the suburbs and you're driving to the grocery store, you can get a lot of things. If you're here in New York, you're having to walk, you're going to have to carry everything back. It's going to be a much smaller space. The aisles are going to be closer together. So I do think that the differences in density of various places has certainly made, these catch-all terms like shelter in place very different realities for people.
Yep.
But there are, of course, no matter where we are, there are places where people come together and congregate in close quarters. And so I think those are those instances where people.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think the Kentucky and Tennessee comparison, though, takes similar to similar, like apples and apples versus, New York, comparing New York State to Kentucky may not have been
Yeah.
as helpful of a comparison.
Right. Kentucky and Tennessee culturally, I think, are very similar. Geographically, they're very similar. Obviously, there's a bit of a slight population difference, but in terms of, rural to urban population centers, both Kentucky and Tennessee have some denser cities, and then the rest of the areas are, more suburban or rural in that sense. So, you're not going to get two identical states
Yeah.
in the nation. It's just not going to happen. But I think we just have to do the best we can with the data that's available to us.
And did it surprise you? Did that first graph, when you started plotting it, right? Like, you don't know exactly because you're just putting in the numbers and you're kind of, putting it in. Did it surprise you how clear it is? I mean, that's, I think, what really struck people is it clearly shows a difference, in
Right.
a curve and a graphable curve.
And it was
Did it
so
surprise you?
visually self-evident. I think that is what, in fact, prompted me. I mean, because I was making it just because I was curious, but
Mhm.
that's really what prompted me to share it in the first place, was just how easy it was to look at it and say, this is connecting some of the pieces of information that I've heard. Even if it was preliminary, right? But it still was something that enabled people to kind of to hold on to that and say, what I'm hearing and what the experts have been telling me, this is exactly what it could in fact look like if we don't take this seriously.
This is why. And I think we all need a why, because we know the what, but the why is.
I think it turned something that was very abstract into something that was very local, now, present, and concrete, right? Rather than just saying it could hypothetically happen, it could happen, it did happen in 1918. It was something that people could look at and say, this is here, this is now, this is two places that I know, and this is actual data, even if it was early data from the last 2 weeks. And so.
Yeah, so you started, a separate Facebook page, right? And
We did,
Twitter
yeah. Most of
to
yeah.
do
In
it.
some ways, just to keep my own privacy on Facebook.
Yes, no,
People
that makes sense.
wanted these things to be shared and updated, and that was, I think, the best and easiest way for me to be able to get that out there without, having to become a completely public figure.
You're like, I really woke up and all of a sudden now you guys wanted this from me. But, what is the plan moving forward then in terms of how long you continue this? I mean, because you're still creating graphs, it seems like at least on that level, you're still invested in giving people an easy way to kind of understand what's going on around them.
Yeah, I think there becomes that part where people start to they're looking for it, and so I have definitely scaled back. I've been putting them out about once a week now because, like I say, we are in sort of this. Well, now we're just sort of waiting and seeing. How is it all going to play out? I do, when I don't publish a graph or give an update, I do get a lot of requests to like, oh, are you going to update it? I'm really looking forward to seeing it. So, so that's kind of the current plan.
No pressure or anything, Stephanie.
Yeah, exactly.
But where have you been? Yes.
Right. So I think it is. I think it is one of those things now where people are still kind of looking for that affirmation that they were able to flatten the curve, and I hopefully we'll see both of those. Both Kentucky and Tennessee will start to see those curves flatten, and I think that's really what people are looking for now, is just that confirmation.
Absolutely. And we'll all learn from it together. And certainly the in this together means trying to digest the information together. So I so appreciated because it is true. I had that reaction and I've seen a lot of graphs, but I'm like, oh, I haven't seen that one. That's a good one. So, I really appreciate the chat and being able to really just talk about how you landed into this place, but a place that is helping us give us all a unique and important perspective.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Yes. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Claudine.